For Black History Month, I'm talking about the work of one black biblical scholar or theologian every day, and today is Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesus and the Disinherited is an early work in the history of black theology that emerged out of a series of sermons and lectures that Howard Thurman gave in the 30s and 40s, in which he tries to reinterpret the ethics of the New Testament in light of the African American experience of segregation in the United States. Jesus and the Disinherited was published just in time to be a significant influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and his ethic of nonviolent resistance, and it's interesting looking back now and seeing how much it also laid the foundations for future black liberation theology. While the book is probably most famous for its influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and its opening chapter that talks about Jesus' ethic of nonviolent resistance, it's actually the last chapter on the topic of love of enemies that sticks with me the most. It is, of course, very easy to say, love your enemy, and it's also very easy for Christians of even modest privilege and lacking any real enemies to completely forget how radical a teaching this really is. It is, of course, much more difficult for an oppressed and hated group with a powerful enemy that is actively trying to hurt them both individually and systemically to say, love your enemies, and to put that ethic into practice. But that's exactly the situation that Jesus was in with respect to the Roman Empire, and that's exactly the situation that many black religious leaders were in with respect to the United States government and huge swaths of the white population besides. And this is why it's so significant that Thurman emphasizes the love of neighbor, dedicates an entire chapter to it, and actually gives a very poignant reason why the oppressed should love their oppressors. There are really only two alternatives to loving our oppressors, either indifference or hatred. The problem with indifference is that it's really a betrayal of everyone the oppressor has ever hurt. Indifference also can't sustain the strength necessary to slowly dismantle oppressive systems over time. The problem with hatred is that over a long enough period of time, it will break down our moral sensibilities, making it very difficult for us to tell the difference between good and evil, and eventually preventing us from being able to relate to even the people we love the most. And so love of enemies emerges as a necessary survival strategy against an oppressor, and it allows an oppressed community to survive with both their morality and their strength and will to resist that oppression intact. I think advice for the oppressed is often a very difficult thing to hear, and if this were coming from anyone else, we'd probably dismiss it out of hand. But just because advice is difficult to hear or can make us uncomfortable doesn't mean that the advice is wrong, and I think Jesus and the Disinherited remains a valuable text to read.